Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Crowded Booth Live. It's a Wednesday. Monday, you had just Ralph and I. Now we add in the middle. He's a little bit fuzzy, but he's coming into focus. Palmer Toms. Palmer, I know you just moved. You're getting ready for a new year. So is the moving done, and are you just kind of ready to start this senior year for you?
The move is done. I'm ready for football to start, for senior year to start, just ready to get on with, get out of this summer that's been a little bit slow in terms of news. That's nothing to talk about.
Yeah, it's like nothing's going on. It's you and I were texting last night. This is wild. We're going to talk more about conference realignment. The title of today's show is "Conference Realignment Will Destroy College Football as We Know It," and I think it's definitely a very bold statement. But I think from what you and I were talking about last night, Palmer, what Ralph and I talked about on Monday, college football is going to change, and the big thing. So Ralph and I touched on this, but I wanted your reaction just for our viewers. I know you and I texted about it, but your quick reaction. Texas, Oklahoma to the SEC. As a guy who covers the SEC, as a guy who was, and correct me if I'm wrong, was at SEC Media Days as this news started to trickle out. What was the feeling amongst the ballroom of all the reporters and journalists, and kind of what is your takeaway from this?
So I was back in Athens on the day that it broke. I was there the day before it happened. But just in terms of, how I feel about it, having grown up in Nashville, Tennessee, kind of the center of the SEC, at least with an SEC program there, 2 SEC programs in the state, coming to Georgia and being here now covering an SEC program and having been to several of these schools, I don't like the move. I think what is important to the SEC is conference pride. And like we said, over text last night, it's what makes you love your team and it's what makes you hate your opponent. And, I as in someone who was a fan growing up, I don't have any sort of emotion towards Texas and Oklahoma. To me, when I think of Texas and Oklahoma, I think of great football games that Georgia has played against both of them. I mean, the 2018 Rose Bowl against Oklahoma was a great game. The 2019 Sugar Bowl against Texas was a great game for them, and not so much for Georgia. I think there's when you're doing conference realignment, what's important is to keep the integrity of the league, and with that in the SEC, it's about. It means more. It just means more. It's about the conference pride and that aspect to it. And I don't think adding Texas or Oklahoma really adds to that. It may diminish it, but I don't really have an emotion that I feel good or bad towards Texas or Oklahoma like I do some other SEC schools, if I'm a fan.
You and I were talking about this last night. If Georgia loses to Florida, which they did last year, that loss stings for a year until they beat them again. Auburn loses to Alabama. That's the conversation that happens year round. I mean, it's funny too. I grew up a Georgia fan. Ralph grew up an Auburn fan. The conversation of who won carried over until the next time they played. I mean, this was just something that was fun. I do agree with you in the sense of when this happens, I don't even know if it's if anymore, but when this happens, and a lot has changed since Monday, you're going to have these unfamiliar, like if Georgia loses to Texas, it is what it is, but you don't have that hatred for Texas that you may have for a Florida, a Tennessee, even a South Carolina, honestly. You and I were talking about that loss to South Carolina Georgia had 2 years back. That was a tough one. Ralph, you and I were talking about this. I mean, And Palmer kind of adds in that. How do you feel about that? As a guy who has the deeply rooted tradition of what the SEC is, I mean, does it mean a little less, or does it not hurt as much, I guess, when you lose those games? I guess it'll still hurt. But you know what I'm saying. Is this something that we're going to see kind of diminish a little bit?
Well, I just don't want to see like the cross-division rivalries go away. You know, I like having the Auburn-Georgia game every year. I know that's a rivalry you cannot take away. But the low-key ones that no one really realizes, like Auburn-Tennessee is a good rivalry. When you have Georgia play, you know, Alabama every once in a while, it's a fun game. I think Georgia and Alabama should play every 2 years. And I know Georgia fans probably want the same thing or don't. It's a toss-up because obviously Alabama's very good. They played this past year. We saw what happened. Both teams were very talented. But that's one thing I don't want to happen because if you had Texas and Oklahoma in, you have a chance of diminishing those other conference rivalries because you got to add 2 more teams and add an extra week game for those teams to play everyone. So some of those games I don't really like to lose, but I know that's what's going to happen if you do add them in. And like what Palmer said, you know, it's just I don't have a hatred for any of those teams. I grew up watching Auburn play, couldn't stand Alabama, couldn't stand Georgia. You know, I couldn't stand LSU, and now we're sitting here now. And you're like, well, now I got to hate Texas and Oklahoma now with it too. But all in all, I just think it's just a bad look for the SEC if this happens because SEC will gain a lot from this, obviously because money wise from Texas and Oklahoma. But then again, you're really diminishing a lot of stuff that happens in the SEC. That's such a very long historic conference with Auburn, Alabama, and Georgia just leading the way. You think of like the face of the SEC, you think of Alabama and Georgia right now because they've always been competing in the SEC championship game. And, with Auburn and Alabama's rivalry and Georgia and Auburn, Georgia, Florida, all those games are just so historic. So, you add Texas and Oklahoma, you're adding the Red River rivalry in there. And that's, I think it's just too much going on in that conference now.
You talked about money-wise, and that's kind of what drives it. So, Palmer, I want to ask you this question. We talked about this. Is this just the tip of the iceberg, in your opinion, of what's about to happen in college football? I mean, the Pac-12 days, the leaders suggested maybe a contingency plan if this does go through. We know there's a couple more steps that have to happen. We're going to get to what the Big 12 issued moments ago, I guess, in the past 3 or 4 hours. But walk me through this. In your opinion, is this just the tip of the iceberg?
For the SEC, I would imagine not. I would imagine that, you're not going to see a conference expand past 16. But, honestly, I didn't think that we would get to this point where Texas and Oklahoma were, in conversations of being an SEC team. So I would imagine that the SEC is done at 16. But as a fallout from that, like you said, you're going to see the other conferences react to it. If the SEC is going to have 16, well, that leaves, it all starts in the Big 12. You lose Texas and Oklahoma. That is really the backing of this conference. And so, now you're down from 10 to 8. I don't know that you can really have a Power 5 conference with 8 teams in it. And especially without, with a major lack of a major brand. And so, you're going to see those 8 teams looking elsewhere. And like you said, I think we're going to touch on it. I think that they are already looking elsewhere. I think you've heard, rumors of TCU reaching out to the Pac-12, Kansas to the Big 10, maybe, Oklahoma State and Baylor are right there as well. I think that there's a lot of dominoes that have to fall. And I think what you're probably looking towards down the road is 4 conferences, maybe 5 of 16 teams. But I really don't think we will ever see the Big 12 as we know it, past 2021. And even then, it's not really going to be the Big 12 as we know it because, there's going to be this news story looming over every Big 12 game, and especially the ones that Texas and Oklahoma are playing in.
It sure will. And I'll ask you this too. It kind of goes into what you were saying. Ralph and I talked about it, so I want you to answer this. You talked about there not being a big brand to carry the Big 12. And in our opinion, we talked about on Monday, Texas and Oklahoma, although Oklahoma in their own right has dominated the conference. To me, they were almost as the same tier as Georgia. They were winning the conference and pushing the playoff there for a while. Texas hasn't been – they have the brand. I mean, everyone knows the burnt orange. Everyone knows horns up, this kind of thing. But you take those 2 brands out and you're talking about what? Baylor, with all due respect, Iowa State. I mean, they're a good football program. I know we've talked about, we had it on the show before, they could be, one of those Cinderella stories this year. But do they have a brand, in your opinion, that could keep it afloat? Could they do that and add some programs in? Or is this just really, in your case, it's about to be a feeding frenzy on the Big 12 if this domino falls?
I mean, you've got Kansas in basketball, but I don't know that basketball is a driving force in any of these decisions that are being made. I think it's football, and in football, you're going to have Oklahoma State maybe as your biggest brand, Baylor. Like you said, Iowa State is a program that has had recent success, but I don't know, a couple of years down the road, who knows where they're going to be? Who knows if their coach is still going to be there, if they're still going to be able to recruit at the same level. And honestly, I don't know that they're, a sustainable brand. It's not really a brand as much as it is, a successful run. And Iowa State, like I said, certainly has had success recently. You've seen Baylor and TCU pushing for a playoff spot back in the first couple of years of it. But things change so quickly that you really need those programs that are going to consistently be there, be in the conversation for a college football playoff spot. Programs that are consistently going to compete for your conference title, and the Big 12 is seriously going to be lacking that. I think you could look towards the American, if you're really trying to add teams. I don't think the Big 12 is going to be able to pull from a Power 5 conference to add to it. So then you're looking towards, some teams that don't necessarily fit at the Power 5 level. You've got SMU there. They've got a rivalry with TCU, and they've had some football success. And obviously, there's financial support there, but I don't know that it's a Power 5 program at any sport, really. Yeah. You've got Houston there, who, once again, had some early success in the playoff era and was made some noise, but, they haven't been as successful of a program. Tulsa, I mean, you could try and dip into Louisiana and get, Louisiana Tech or Louisiana Lafayette, and the Big 12 has shown that they don't necessarily have to stick by geographical, the Southwest standpoint. They've got West Virginia, who doesn't fit. Could you see them maybe try and go after a UCF? It doesn't make sense from a geographical standpoint. I don't know that there are enough teams in that Southwest part of the U.S. that really fit, a Power 5 Big 12 conference, and there's certainly not anyone of the caliber of Oklahoma or Texas.
Ralph and I were talking about this on Monday. If you're going to add, it has to bring value. You can't just have the knee-jerk reaction to add. I got two things I want to talk about real quick. The Big 12. We're talking about them. Let's stay right there. They issue a cease and desist against ESPN, and you pointed and laughed about it. Their own network that televises these games and all this crazy stuff. Walk me through this. What is happening in the Big 12 right now, Palmer? I mean, this is something that I said it on Monday. It's going to be unprecedented because of the amount of money you're dealing with. Now the Big 12 issues a cease and desist, and I want to read this as well before I get to letting you talk about it. This is what it says. The current business partner of the Big 12 Conference, ESPN, has taken certain actions that are intended to not only harm the Big 12, but to result in financial benefits for ESPN. Palmer, that's a pretty bold statement. So when you hear that, how does this play out legally?
I have no clue. I have no clue because, what they're saying is that, ESPN has understood, has been a driving force in Texas and Oklahoma leaving, headed to the SEC. And in order to make that move, that transition happen even smoother, the ESPN has been going behind the Big 12's back to, reach out to some of these other schools to reach out to other conferences. That's your SparkNotes version of what the cease and desist said.
There you go.
I don't know what it means. I think ultimately, what all this means is, you've seen the Texas and Oklahoma say that they are not planning on re-signing the contract, and that expires at the end of June 2025, meaning that they could make the move to another conference July 1st, 2025. I have a really hard time picturing Texas or Oklahoma being, waiting out 4 football seasons. I think it's not possible, just the timing of this move, it's not possible to do it for the 2021 season. But I think that you could possibly see, with how quickly everything has happened. I mean, this time a week ago, this story was breaking, and now we're talking about them, having a legal lawsuit against them from their own conference. Or, it's kind of crazy how quickly these wheels have turned on this story. And I think if you're looking at it, down the road, I think these 2 schools would like to have this move done by July 1st, 2022, so that they could make the move into the SEC for next football season. And I don't know if that's even possible, but I think, if the Big 12 is falling apart, which it kind of looks like it is from an outsider's perspective, it looks like it's falling apart, that's going to make that move even easier.
It definitely will. I know they were talking about, there's some rumors on Twitter around saying they are definitely lawyering up to try to fight that, and we'll see how that goes. We're going to talk about some potential options. We're going to call it the War of Realignment when we come back from commercial, and talk about maybe who are the crown jewels that could be left standing in the dust when we come back. We're going to talk about that. Palmer and Ralph are going to give us their hot schools, who are going to be the crown jewels that could be taken when realignment dust settles.
Cook's Place began serving our signature hot dogs in 1985 from a cart on Broadway. We still serve the best hot dogs and scrambled dogs in town at the corner of Moon and Miller Road and at the landings. Our friendly staff won't let you leave hungry. Come in and eat to the beat with our 50s jukebox. Cook's Place, fast service, great people, awesome food. What are you waiting for?
We're talking about conference realignment here on the Crowded Booth Live Wednesday. We appreciate you tuning in. If it's on Facebook, YouTube, or on Twitter, we thank you for watching. Make sure to subscribe, follow, hit those notification buttons so you know where we are. Palmer Toms and Ralph Leary here alongside us. Ralph, I hadn't let you talk in a while, so I'm going to give you the first crack at this one. We're calling it the War of Realignment, and yes, I stole that from somewhere. I've seen that kind of floating around. Who is the crown jewel? Who is the one woman that you're picking out at the dance that you're going to ask to dance? If this is indeed a team that you want to come join your conference when the dust settles, let's say Texas, Oklahoma, it's a done deal, signed, sealed, delivered. You're sitting there as one of you're not the Big 12, obviously, you're not the SEC, but tell me who you're trying to pick up. Maybe it's 1 or 2 schools that you feel like could really help your case.
I think it's pretty obvious. I mean, it's UCF and Houston are probably the top 2, honestly. I think Houston is greatly located for if it is Big 12, obviously we're not talking about that. But Houston's been pretty good the past few years. They do a great job recruiting. They're in a great city. They'll make a lot of money if they're in a bigger conference. UCF, they've been on the uprise for the past few years. They've been wanting to move to a different, bigger conference so they can have a better chance of making the playoffs. Just got Gus Malzahn as a head coach. He's going to bring a lot of spark to that city. You're going to see a lot more people start to show up for UCF, and I think that's a huge thing for them. If they jump to a bigger conference, I could really see that being your number 1 team to go after. And another one that not really a dark horse, but one that kind of is overlooked is Cincinnati because they're doing so well in their conference. They probably don't want to move out of their conference, but they're probably ready to play better opponents. And I think their coach, Luke Fickell, said it last year, it doesn't matter who you play. We just want to play whoever it is. It doesn't matter who they are and what their record is. We just want to play them. So Cincinnati, Houston, and UCF, all from the American Conference, probably the best 3 teams out of that conference right now. Those are your crown jewels, I think.
I like that one. I like that one. You talked about Houston. We talked about SMU as well, Palmer. Those are 2 programs that are in high-profile media areas, Dallas and Houston. We're going to talk more about the American Conference in a second. But for you're sitting there, and maybe you are the Pac-12 or the Big Ten or the ACC. Let's say you're one of the remaining Power 5 as we know it. Who is at school for you that you're like, I want to zone in on this one as we try to keep up with this arms race?
Well, it feels like cheating, but Notre Dame. I mean, it's maybe quite possibly the biggest brand in college football. If you're the ACC, you've got to try and get Notre Dame as a full-time conference member. And we got a taste of what it looked like last season. You know, Bryce, you probably could give a better perspective covering an ACC team and having been at ACC Media Days. Notre Dame is a huge piece in all this realignment. I think they're going to be hesitant to do it, but depending on how the college football playoff is structured down the road, depending on how conferences are structured down the road, they may have their, hand forced and they may have to join a conference. I think, again, they had to do it last year based on scheduling purposes and stuff. But Notre Dame is the crown jewel to me. And I think if you're looking outside of that, we haven't really mentioned a lot of Pac-12 schools. I think Boise State would be a program that you try and go after. I don't know that they play at a Power 5 conference level for sports outside of football. But football is the one that's driving all of this. I think BYU would be another team that you would try and go after. And that's an independent like Notre Dame. They may be hesitant to make that move. And then I think you've got to go after some of the remaining Big 12 schools. Like we said, Baylor, TCU, Oklahoma State, Kansas State, Iowa State. You've got that's 5. West Virginia. West Virginia would be
anyone but Kansas.
Yeah. And I think West Virginia is probably one too that the ACC could go after.
Yeah, and so we were talking about this on Monday, and I said this. I said to me the ACC, and this is just kind of what it is. It lacks funding and dead last of all Power 5 conferences with their media deal. The ACC network is still something that's brand new. Pac-12 has their network with Fox that's done pretty well on the West Coast. Us on the East Coast, we just don't watch a ton of that, but they do very well with their Fox deal, Fox being based out there in LA. You talked about, obviously, the SEC there's the Big Ten network, seems that he does well. So the ACC is kind of lacking. So the big thing in the conversation as we were in the ballroom in Charlotte and the news starts to trickle, you can see it start happening. And I think for the new commissioner, he was just glad that his opening spiel went before all of this happened because God only knows what it would have been like to have that during the middle of it. But the conversation was before, because that was one of the questions brought up. Notre Dame loves their NBC deal, and for good reason. They rake in. I mean, they got to back the Brinks truck up to the back of the facility and just unload it. I mean, it's quite ridiculous the amount of money they're making off that deal. That would be the big deal breaker. But we had a great comment from one of our viewers on Monday that I wanted to point out, and he said he feels that Notre Dame would make the jump if they felt like they were forced by the rest of the country, the only way they could get in. Because you think about this, if we go to what you were talking about, Palmer, to this pseudo 4, let's just say 4 mega conferences, and I even said it could get real crazy and you could almost look like the NFL with 2 big conferences split east and west, and you have an NFL style playoff. Let's hypothetically say that happens. Notre Dame is not going to be left out. They're going to have a little FOMO. They're going to have some fear of missing out, and they're going to say we got to get in there. And so for the ACC standpoint, I think it starts and ends the conversation with Notre Dame. You can't have a knee-jerk reaction and bring in no disrespect, a West Virginia and UCF. All those are great programs. I think Notre Dame has to be a part of the deal to keep the ACC relevant. And that's just because of how top-heavy they've been. And then also you see some of the other brands that would get pushed down because of all of that. They're so top-heavy where the other conferences have been. There's not a ton of depth. Now, I feel like it's growing. We're seeing some of that growth happen there. But like we were talking about, this is something that'll be very interesting to see how it develops. Wanted to ask you guys this too. We'll start with Palmer. We'll go back to Ralph. We haven't really talked about this, but how does the American Conference benefit? Because you listed some of the schools, and I think when you go down and you look at the geographical locations of the American Conference, you start to say, holy cow, Orlando, Tampa, Memphis, Houston, Dallas. Excuse me, is Tulane, aren't they in the American Conference?
Yep.
Okay, that's the New Orleans area, obviously. Those are some pretty big markets that we don't talk about. So in your opinion, what would happen, Palmer? Could the American rise as that 5th power conference? Let's say if they picked up a TCU and an Oklahoma State and just added it, because they're already kind of spread out as is. And obviously don't forget Cincinnati's also there too. So when you see this, I mean, is this an opportunity for the American Conference to say, okay, now we are the Power 5?
Yeah, they've said that they were the Power 6, and this is their opportunity to be a Power 5 program. You pick up Oklahoma State, and you get that Oklahoma City market. TCU, that's Dallas Fort Worth, and you've already got a natural rival there between TCU and SMU. And let's not forget, it's not that long ago that TCU was in the Mountain West. I mean, it wouldn't be that crazy of a move to see TCU. I mean, it would be weird to see these programs, these schools make the move down, but in a way, if they all did it together, it could be, them sticking together and helping the AAC move up to being a Power 5, and it would almost be, you would lose again. They would be in a conference that lacks a major brand like Texas or Oklahoma, but I think you would see the American be that fifth conference. And so in a way, it would be kind of a status quo of them, if they all stuck together. And I think that would be a really important part. You can't just be two of these schools making the move to the American, because then it's like, hey, TCU, Baylor, you drop down from the Power 5 to a group of 5. It's got to be a group effort. And if you do it that way, you can still – it can still be a Power 5 conference, and it just elevates what, UCF and Cincinnati and Memphis and SMU and Houston and Tulane and all those programs, it elevates what they are. So I think, again, it's got to be a group effort. If you're going to make that move, it's possible. It's absolutely possible. And that would keep college football more like it is today than 4 mega conferences or 2 divisions, East and West, like you said. That would keep it similar to what it is today with the 5 power conferences. And I think the American would absolutely love to do that. So if you're the American commissioner, I don't know who that is, but if you're the American commissioner and you're not trying to start conversation about maybe picking up some of these Big 12 schools, and I know the conferences cannot reach out to the schools. The schools have to be the ones reaching out to the conferences. That's an important part of this. I don't know whether TCU and these remaining Big 12 schools would be reaching out to the American, or whether that would be plan B to going to the Pac-12, the Big 10, the ACC. But if it happened, that kind of keeps the structure of college football where it's at.
You talked about brand strength, too. When you look at some of those programs, I think in the American Conference, Ralph and I talked about this. We didn't talk about it on Monday. We talked about it kind of off air. There's a lot of growth to be had in that conference. I mean, especially with what you've seen. I gave you 6 or 7 markets that are among the, let's just say, top 50 markets in the U.S. I mean, and this is no disrespect. New Orleans, Tampa, Orlando, Dallas, Houston, and Cincinnati, Memphis are all bigger markets than Auburn, Alabama. They are. They're all. I mean, they just are. Now, Auburn also benefits from the Birmingham area, but they really are. And so I think when you see how American could do that with what you just proposed, you could see them rise. And I think too, if you are a fan, the traditional fan, which I think all 3 of us are, we want to see that stay like that. You're hoping, and thanks for, I know you've been on this podcast, Michael Oresco. There we got our guy right there who is letting us know who the commissioner of the American is. If you're Mike, you want to be the biggest Michael Oresco fan, because you want them to stay and say, hey, just pick up some of those teams, let some of the others kind of fall where they may, and see what happens. Ralph, for you, I mean, this is something you've seen a lot of Group of 5 stuff. We know the American Conference has what it takes to compete. This gives them that outlet to say, okay, here we go. We're going to roll with this, and we're going to see what happens.
Well, I think one thing you need to do first, if the Big 12 starts to diminish and teams start looking for other conferences, go after some of those Big 12 schools. But if that doesn't happen anytime soon, start looking for Liberty or BYU, because those teams are both huge teams that have been dominating the past few years. Obviously, Liberty had a great year this past year. They're on a great up-and-coming season. Behind Malik Willis at quarterback. They're going to be looking for a conference sooner or later, and I think the American Conference is a great fit for them. If not, probably Sun Belt, Conference USA, because you're going to start somewhere small. But BYU, this is the time for them to start making a jump back to a conference again for football. Yeah. Obviously, they compete in different conferences and other sports, but BYU needs to make a jump. And I think if they're added to American Conference and or added with on Oklahoma State and TCU, you're looking at your next Power 5. The Big 12 will drop. It won't be your Power 5 anymore. It'll be the American Conference, and I think that's a great fit for them. I think BYU is really the dark horse, not really dark horse. It's the golden apple right now. For honestly, if they join a conference and it's not one of the Power 5s right now, that's your new conference for Power 5. And if they join the Big 12, it could possibly help.
Yeah,
be a big brand team. Obviously, it's a little different area. It's not really a big media area, but still, they bring a lot of. They do very well every year. They compete very well, and I think they can somewhat help carry with another big school if they are added in there also.
They could, and I've seen a lot of rumors potentially Pac-12 might try to go with them as well, which would be a big get for them as well. Got a comment right here. Chris Bryan, appreciate you tuning in once again, Chris. I think we'll see 4 conferences. You can see SEC, ACC, Big Ten, and Pac-12. I want to ask you this too, because this kind of follows what Chris was saying. And then once again, we got Boise State too. They need a shot. Yeah, we definitely think that Boise State could be one of those brands that gets picked up. Somebody wants to bring the Smurf turf and play conference games there. That would be fantastic outside the Mountain West. Super conferences. How do you feel about these, Palmer? We talked about this. All this conversation we've had as we wrap up here tonight. I know you're a traditionalist in a sense. You kind of let off with it. But super conferences, what does it do to the game of football aside from the regional rivalry standpoint? Does it make it more like an NFL type of situation where you see – I mean, we know behind closed doors it's all about the money. But no one at this point, to me, gives a hill of beans about the small-town rivalries, going to the diner and arguing about who's going to win the Auburn-Georgia game that year. It's about the money, and I think that's sad because we had a comment the other day that was just true. It said, our fans, we've kidded ourselves for years about this, but this could just be the tip of the iceberg.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. It's really hard to take it as a fan. And I think everyone that is in college football media is a fan of the sport. Mm-hmm. And I think it's hard to see some of those things that you've loved as a fan diminish and get demolished by conference realignment. I think it's really tough. I think, going back to the regional aspect of it, I think it's been the way that college football has been set up for years now is that you have a sense of regional pride and being able to say, hey, my team is the best team in our X amount of states. My team is the best team in the Southeast. My team is the best team in the Southwest. My team is the best team in the Midwest. My team is the best team on the East Coast. My team is the best team on the West Coast. You're not going to see that anymore because how can you determine who the best team in the Southwest is if Texas is simultaneously West Coast and Southeast?
Yeah. Wow. I had to leave it on there for a second because that's really good. I mean, you talk about when you have the bragging rights of a conference, it means, like, let's say when Alabama wins, they know we are the best team from right now, how it is, from College Station, Texas, all the way over to, I don't know, Columbia, South Carolina, or however east. We know we are the best team in that area. And I think, too, we've talked about this, Ralph and I have, off air, about when they saw the news coming out. Ralph and I were texting each other, and I know you and I were texting each other yesterday about this. I mean, I agree with you. To me, college football is the greatest sport there is. And listen, I love baseball. Baseball is I love the Braves, love baseball, love everything about it. But college football, man, it does something different, especially with how it is. And I actually saw an interview that I wanted to point out just the difference of what this would do to the SEC landscape. JT Daniels at SEC Media Days, I was listening. I don't remember which radio show it was on, but he was on Radio Row, and he talked about how this past year with limited capacity was crazier than the Pac-12 when he played his first 2 years and was a part of the team. Not anything against the Pac-12. West Coast has its own thing but just the Southeast, the culture of what football is, I think I don't want to say you would lose fans from it, but I just think it would just be different if we went to these pseudo conferences. And I'll ask you this too. What is the point of Vanderbilt competing in the SEC anymore? Because you take a team that, let's say at their height, and Ralph and I talked about this on Monday, at their height when they had James Franklin. This was a team that was hitting 7 to 8 wins. They really, I mean, they were a
2013. They beat Kentucky, Florida,
Yes.
Georgia, and Tennessee.
I mean, this is a team that they legitimately in 2013 had SEC title aspirations to go. So let's just say that is their ultimate peak. Now they have a new coach. We'll see what happens, all this stuff. You knock them down from a 6-win team. Now, if you add these other two programs in, to about a 3 to 4 win team currently. And it's just, you can't compete in the football atmosphere. And Ralph and I talked about this. Obviously, Vandy has it going in baseball. Other schools have it. But I just think we're going to see something because football drives the bus. And basketball carries a little bit of weight, but football drives the bus. And to me, it's going to see football change forever. Palmer, any closing thoughts I'll give you here as I've talked long enough? What do you want to see happen? What do you just wish this would all go away?
Yeah, I mean, can we just go back to honestly? Can we go back to the SEC without Texas A&M and Missouri? Send them back to the Big 12 and actually have the Big 12 have 12 teams.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I wish we could go back to that because regional pride is such a big deal to me, and when you're doing this conference realignment, it's not about seeing great football games. That's what out-of-conference scheduling is for. That's what the expanded playoff is for. I'm all for seeing Georgia play Oklahoma. I was planning on making my first trip to Norman in 2023 to see Georgia and Oklahoma play then. I wasn't thinking it was going to be a conference game. I'm all for going to Austin, Texas. Guess what? Georgia had that scheduled for 2028, 2029. And I mean, that's what's so exciting to me about out-of-conference games is what makes them special is that you don't see them every year. And if you start seeing Georgia and Oklahoma every year, Georgia and Texas every year, it's just not going to be special. And I think in order for a game like that to be special, it has to have the historical backing that Auburn and Georgia has, that Georgia and Florida has. And honestly, it's got to have that regional sense of, hey, my neighbor is a Georgia fan and I'm an Auburn fan, or vice versa. You know, there's got to be a sense of division in a geographical area for there to be that sense of rivalry that makes that game that's played every year important, because it's, hey, I don't like this team and I love this team and I hate this team, you know, and vice versa. So, you know, I guess in closing, I'm all for an expanded playoff. I'm all for great out-of-conference scheduling, because that's when you see these non-traditional rival matchups. You know, you can even create a non-traditional rivalry like what Alabama and Clemson have created, you know, and that's been created naturally because they've been playing at the highest stakes in you know, for a national championship or for a spot in the national championship. You don't see Clemson joining the SEC, because if Clemson was playing Alabama every year for a spot in the SEC championship, it wouldn't mean as much as it currently does when they play for a spot in the national championship or for that college football playoff trophy. So, you know, I'm all for expansion. You know, I'm for change in college football. I think, you know, that it's important that college football changes with the times and changes with, you know, NIL and transfer portal and all that. You know, college football is different in 2021 than it was in 2000. It's different in 2021 than it was in 2010. I mean, you know, it's important to be able to change with the times, but I think there are certain aspects of college football that need to stay traditional. And I think these conferences and these regional aspect, sense of pride in your conference, it just means more. And the SEC has done a great job of it, making it mean more. And I think by adding Texas and Oklahoma, I don't know that you make it mean less, but it definitely doesn't mean more.
Yeah. Wow. I feel like that quote run day is going to run somewhere about that's a really good closing remark. I want to get to one last comment that I just thought was funny as we show here. Shea Solo watching over on YouTube. He can determine that Memphis is the best team in the state of Tennessee, and I love it. That is true, sadly, for Tennessee fans. Shea, we appreciate you tuning in as well. And you know, that does happen. We're talking about best teams being in the state, and I do get that. Sometimes there are better programs. I guess more of just if you aren't as bad as Tennessee has been recently. Anyways, Palmer, we appreciate you coming on, man. I'm going to, link up with you to get a podcast to do maybe an in-depth Georgia preview as we Wow, it's July 28th, and we are well on our way to college football season. We appreciate it. As for Ralph Palmer, we say so long. We'll see you once again on Monday. Palmer will hook up and get together to do a podcast. It's going to be a ton of fun. We will talk about that very soon. But as for everyone else, we appreciate you. Stay tuned for the podcast that's going to drop this Friday, and then we'll see you once again here live on Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube once again on Monday. Thanks, everyone, for watching.